On numerous occasions, in the cases we have covered, we've grappled with the goings-on beyond the incident or the crime themselves that have left us staring, bewildered, with so many questions. While the voice and human experience of victims and survivors remains our core focal point, it is the at times seemingly nonsensical processes that are often the source of so much frustration. And although this case would be one of the biggest and most emotive that the City of Adelaide would ever see, as is the way with our city, drama would move out of the courtroom and into the streets. Opinions would be plentiful and just as divisive as they were volatile. Decisions would be argued, and some simply would be unable to contain themselves to play within the rules that had been set. As high a priority as this case was, as emotive as it had proven to be, and as much as the details and evidence were speculated about, it would all be relegated temporarily to taking a seat on the bench. The umpire's call is final, and so would be the decision handed down by the courts about how the evidence could be publicised in the death of Phil Walsh on this, the next episode of Just Lawful.
Adelaide is the perfect place to set a horror story. You know why all those films and books are always set in sleepy conservative towns? Because sleepy conservative towns are where those things happen. Exorcism, omens, shining, poltergeists. Adelaide is Amityville or Salem, and things here go bump in the night.
Welcome once again to Just Lawful, where things do indeed go bump in the night. My name is Daniel Panozzo, and I am again joined, as always, by my co-host, Sean Fuster.
Thanks, Daniel. Welcome, everyone.
Welcome indeed. Before we really kick off, I do want to say, Sean, you and I never got into this project as such to, I guess, for accolade, and certainly not also to stir up, and certainly not to shy away from controversy, etc. But it's probably fair to say this week especially, we've had some interesting feedback and opinions around, I guess, the way you and I have seen this case, our perspective on that, and I guess how that's butted up against some other people.
It's the nature of the beast when it comes to this case. I don't think anybody's ever going to agree wholeheartedly with our opinion, or probably even the opinion of the person next to them. It is truly divisive for all the reasons we've discussed, and for many reasons that we haven't even gotten to yet.
Absolutely, and as you said, you know, it's not necessarily going to agree with everyone, and the person standing next to you is not necessarily going to agree with you, and so on and so on. And just on that, what we do want to say is, though, thank you to everyone who has listened and who has heard the broadcast either on 5AA or on one of the podcast platforms, iTunes, Spotify. If you haven't heard the episodes leading up to this, we would greatly appreciate and certainly strongly recommend you go back and listen to not just this series, but all of the series that we've done to know how we got to this point, and possibly how we're going to look to go forward in this. Before we go any further, similar to all of the episodes in this series, if you do hear anything that is disturbing or concerning for yourself, or if you have anyone you know who is in a vulnerable mental state, as always, please make use of the available resources in your area. If you are local to us, of course, the South Australian Government Mental Health Triage Service on 131 465, or the Acute Crisis Intervention Support Line on 131 466. They are just a couple of the available resources. Please, if you need them, make use of those in your area. Now that is out of the way, Sean, we left our last episode knowing that you had the heaviest textbook you said you'd ever had, and you were heading back across Victoria Square, and you had gone back to the Advertiser building. You'd sat down with the editor and the general manager and the sports editor and said, hey, here's what we've got. What can we do? How do we use this? Pick up from there.
So think about this for a moment, Daniel, and all you listeners out there. You've heard over the past 3 episodes the volume of information that was in the Cy Walsh documentation. You've also heard the lack of consistency that was in that documentation. The fact that I walked out of that court registry on September 16, 2015, none the wiser as to whether this was a case of drug-induced psychosis, whether it was a case of ongoing mental illness, or whether it was a case of clear-cut murder. Imagine me presenting all of that to you as a newspaper editor and saying, well, boss, what do we do with this?
it's bizarre to think that, as you said, the volume of evidence and declarations and all of those things, the statements that you've just gone through and read, and to not necessarily be any clearer one way or another on exactly what it is you're looking at this stage.
And that was the biggest problem for all of us that were sitting in that room right now. There was nothing definitive. There was no mast to pin the colours to. What were we going to do? Were we going to go with a triple barrel headline that said, is this murder, is this mental instability, or is this a drug case? Because everybody knew that already.
Yeah.
That's nothing new to anybody. Are we going to get into the weeds and start pulling apart some of the information? Well, how much room can we give this? How quickly can Sean turn around 7 boxes full of information into an article? Also, when are we going to publish? You've got the situation right now. It's September. Anybody that knows anything about football knows that September is a very important time in the football calendar. You're getting into the finals. You're getting into the nitty-gritty of the whole thing. The Crows have already suffered the biggest loss they could possibly lose in the form of the death of Phil Walsh. Do you publish this information while football season's on and possibly risk the entire town turning against you, saying you're just trying to torpedo the Crows? Do you hold on to it and hope that nobody else gets it? What master are you serving in this moment? And atop all of that, the editor of the Tiser at the time was a man by the name of Sam Weir. Sam, as I've said before on this show, was the court reporter before I was. It's why he knew to apply for things like the declarations. Sam has a very keen legal mind, and he sat there and listened to me recount as much as I could in this meeting and just started shaking his head. He's like, Sean, we can't use any of this. I said, I'm relieved to hear you say that, Sam. He said, look, if we report this now, there is no possibility of impaneling a jury anywhere in this country that would come to it with an unbiased view. And you think about it, this is the sort of article that would be the front page of every News Corp paper. It would be picked up by breakfast radio, by breakfast television, Sunrise and the Today Show would be, splashing it all over. Advertiser reports this, that, and the other. How are you going to find 12 impartial people anywhere in the nation of Australia to sit on a trial of this magnitude after all of that information is out?
It's funny, sorry, I don't mean funny isn't comical at all. It's funny listening to that. This case takes on such a unique, identity in the sense that we know how big a priority it is and how much sort of publicity it's already got just by the nature of the victim involved. We also know that, as you said, you've now got your hands on something that, by your own admission, you're not sure you should actually have access to. You've now got the added complexity, which has never, been involved in anything of, just due to the nature of the time of year and the sporting calendar, are we willing to run this now? That's a consideration you don't have to normally make. And you've got a very learned editor at the time going, from a legal perspective, we can't use this right now because we may look to then, we could certainly damage the trial process and anyone being able to be involved in that from a juror and or the accused having a fair trial. So that's a very unique perspective across, as if this wasn't already a very unique case, there's these extra elements.
Any one of those factors alone
Yes.
would be an unprecedented day at the office. All of them together was a perfect storm of unprecedented nature. So this wasn't even a situation where we felt like we needed to call the lawyers. News papers have always got a lawyer on speed dial. No need. We knew in that moment, in that room, this is going to go in the vault. The question was, what do we do with it in the meantime? And so the decision was made, Sean, take yourself off the grid for a couple of days. Don't worry about going into court. We'll make sure that the 2 other court reporters that work with you take the bulk of the load. Sit down and get this written.
So the editor's saying, although we can't use this now, put yourself in voluntary exile or out of sort of mainstream and write the story anyway.
That's right. Write it while it's fresh. Write it while it's all in your mind.
Sure.
We can alter it down the track. Say we run it in 6 weeks' time.
Mm-hmm.
We'll update it. We'll make alterations. Say we run it in 6 months' time. Say we never get to run it.
Yeah.
Well, at least we'll have it. It's kind of what I like to think of as the obituary mentality.
Sure.
Newspapers are constantly updating the obituaries of famous people.
Okay.
So that if they pass away, the document's ready to go. The story's there, filed. So I was writing this in the idea that eventually I would what we call top and tail it.
Sure.
Write the middle of the story, write everything that was on the documents, and eventually I would top this with, the trial started or finished this way, and finish it with, and now the sentence is or is not this.
Okay. Well, that's an interesting insight, I guess, to your process. There was a question I want to ask you with that, though. If that's the case of write the story now and put it away, what do we think? There's probably a lot of people out there going, but we want to know the information now. Don't hold on to that. We have a right to know, we're the public. I guess in that sense of, and we just said we don't want to spoil the trial process, what would you say to those people? Why is it not a good idea, advantageous beyond that? Because there's a lot of people probably going, yeah, but we want to know.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, I wouldn't have pulled the documents if I hadn't wanted to know. Sam wouldn't have sent me to get them if he didn't want to know. I recognize that voracious appetite for knowledge. But you've got to remember that journalism is tertiary to the trial process. Not even secondary, but tertiary. If the courts do not operate in the proper manner, we have nothing to report on. And most importantly, above all else, there is Meredith Walsh in the middle of all this. A woman who has lost her husband, whose son may now be lost to her, in circumstances that, having read all these documents together as we effectively have on this show, we know the fraught situation. Who am I as a journalist to come and write a story that removes the possibility of justice for a victim, whatever form that justice may take? It's incredibly impossible right now. It's a Schrodinger's box kind of situation right now. What is justice going to look like in the Phil Walsh case? I don't know at this time. So who am I to take that chance away from her? It would be like, to make a comparison, me having access to all the documentation in Hillier, the triple murder case, or Zara Abrahimzadeh, everything that came out in the coronial inquest. Let's take Zara's case. Let's say I knew everything that we found out later in that coronial inquest prior to Ziola Abrahimzadeh taking the stand. There would never have been that moment of him breaking on the stand, confessing. Zara's children would never have gotten justice if I'd reported all that earlier, because it would have been impossible to convene a trial. There is the potential every day that I step through the doors of that courthouse that I could say, do, write, or publish something that will destroy somebody's access to justice. Now, if you've heard me for even a second on this show, you know the last thing I want to do is ruin a victim's chance for justice. That's the overriding mentality that I have. And that made it a very easy decision for me to say, yeah, I'm sure the public wants to know. You'll know when the time's right.
As with so many of the cases we cover, Sean, it is not just the incident or the crime itself that holds our attention. This is clearly no different in the fact that what would start to occur around the proceedings and what would happen outside of this would be just as fascinating as intriguing as what on earth do you do with this documentation? How on earth do you use it? What is the next piece of this?
And a lot of the times on this show, we skip over this sort of stuff. With Hillier, we talked about the fact that there were massive gaps between court appearances. Cy Walsh wasn't due to appear in court again until November the 3rd. But between September 16th and November 3rd of 2015, there's a lot of stuff that happened that's very much worth our analysis.
Okay.
And it all started the very next morning. Within hours of the advertiser deciding as an entity, we will not be publishing this information.
Sure.
We received an email from the court registry.
Okay.
Telling us that Magistrate Elizabeth Shepherd, who had granted me access to the documentation, was rescinding my access to the documentation.
So hang on. So just for reference, that would make it the 17th. So the 15th is when you were granted the access at 4 o'clock in the afternoon.
That's right.
16th, you went and got a RSI hand cramp from writing seven boxes of notes.
Yep.
And then the next morning, someone somewhere has rethought this decision and gone, yeah, maybe Sean shouldn't be treading in that area either.
So, of course, I politely respond, that's understood. Thank you very much. I'm actually finished with the boxes anyway.
Okay.
At that time, I'm thinking, let's just play it a bit cool here. Let's play it a bit safe. A much more formal letter followed from the Courts Administration Authority as an entity.
Okay.
Sent to both myself and the advertiser. That the magistrate has grave misgivings about the advertiser's access to this information and the nature and content of that information, and how it would be very concerning if that information were to be published.
Okay.
Now, this is, despite how it sounds and despite the look on your face right now, not a threat.
No, I wasn't taking it as that. I was more thinking that someone somewhere has gone, we realised, there's some stuff in there that we don't necessarily want Sean to know about, and we're certainly worried about how that might get used.
It also goes a step beyond.
Okay.
We know we have no legal way of stopping him.
Okay, right. Interesting.
We've granted him access to this information. The advertiser is completely within its legal rights to publish all of this. Now, that may not mean that they don't ruin a trial, all those bigger ethical legal concerns that we've already come to. But on a procedural nature, they could not stop us.
Right, okay.
If they wanted to stop us, they'd have to call it back into court and impose a suppression order.
Right, okay.
We would then, under the rules of the court, have the right to argue that suppression order. We'd also have the right to bring in lawyers.
Right.
And if our lawyers wanted to argue, well, you've released the information, it's, fair and reasonable report of court proceedings, etc., 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 we may very well win that suppression order. So this is almost a, can we perhaps gently warn you off doing this because we really don't want to make a bigger deal?
Yeah, right.
Because think about this too. If you have to hold a suppression order hearing, that has to go on the public court list that appears every day. Mm-hmm. All the other media is going to see Cy Walsh's name pop up well before November 3rd, 2015.
I want to know what's going on.
They're going to attend.
Yeah.
They're going to hear the advertiser's got them documentation. They're going to want it. Suddenly, this smallish problem of Sean and the advertiser having this information turns into a much larger issue.
Okay. Well, I mean, thankfully, as you said, yourself and Sam had already made the decision. We're not going to publish this. We recognise how damaging that could be. So you obviously don't act on that. So what happens then?
So we write back an email that says effectively what you've just said. Look, before you even came to this realisation, courts, we already knew that you'd handed us a hand grenade.
Okay.
We have diffused it. We have put it in the box. We have no intention of throwing this anytime soon.
Sure.
And it was pretty much left at that.
Right.
An uncomfortable détente. They know we've got it. We know they don't want us to use it. Let's all just walk away.
Okay.
So I get to writing. Lock myself in my office for a couple of days because it takes a while to siphon 7 boxes of information down into those 3 categories that we turned it into.
So even though you're not going to use it, you're still going to write the story?
Absolutely. Sam's opinion was, write it while you're in the moment. It's fresh in your head. You have the feeling. Do it now. But this all takes time.
Sure.
And without wanting to big note myself, when I go missing from the courthouse, rival journalists notice.
So at this stage, you're writing a story, therefore you're not in court, attendance at court, obviously.
I am writing from sunup to sundown, trying to get through these documents, trying to turn it into articles. I've got 2 other court reporters I work with who are fantastic. They're going to court every day. And eventually the other media starts to notice.
Okay.
Where's Sean? What's Sean working on right now? They did a fantastic job, my colleagues, of deflecting ideas. Oh, he's working on a project. He's got a day off today, whatever they needed to say. Mm-hmm. You don't have to play fair with the competition.
Yeah, fair.
But eventually, somehow, word got out.
Okay.
I don't know to this day how. I don't know whether another colleague somewhere might have said, we know something you don't know, or we're sitting on a really hot story.
Sure.
Or whether people eventually realised the last time we saw Sean in court was for Cy Walsh, and we haven't seen him since. Oh, dear God, he's got the documents, doesn't he? However it happened, the media eventually went, we need those documents.
Okay.
Because this is all about the exclusive.
Yeah.
It's all about breaking that news. It's all about being the number 1 news resource in the state.
And it doesn't get bigger than this case to break.
Not at all, because you think about it, that information goes out, and like we said earlier, it's the Today Show. It's Sunrise the next day.
Yeah.
It's the leading thing around the country.
Sure.
So the courts get inundated with applications by media, not just local media, but interstate media, all wanting access to these documents that they don't know for a fact that I have, but they're not prepared to take the risk.
Yep.
It gets so bad that the Cy Walsh case is actually called back on for a special hearing on September 30th, 2015.
Okay.
More than a month ahead of when it was supposed to come back. Couple of caveats before we get into this, Daniel. It is not unusual for a magistrate to call the parties back to court when the media makes an application.
Okay.
To double check with the prosecution and defence whether it's the right thing to do.
Sure.
But remember, as we've talked about before, a judge or a magistrate has unfettered discretion as to whether a document is released.
As you said before, in the case of being handed a sword and denied a photo, for example.
Exactly right. There's no sense, nor rhyme, nor reason, nor consistency. It's based on individual magistrate's decision.
Right.
Magistrate Elizabeth Shepherd, who gave me access to this documentation, then rescinded it, wanted to talk to the parties, Prosecutor Lucy Board and Defence Counsel Greg Mead. And she said, "There's a level of speculation in the public arena about this case which is concerning. My concern is releasing this information may distort and exacerbate the situation." And then she said this, "I think there's just a great deal of speculation about this case, which is unfortunate. It seems to me that the case could be committed today," by which she means sent off to trial.
Okay.
"And questions of whether or not a mental incompetence defence is available could be explored in the next jurisdiction." Every journalist in the room sat up like a meerkat that had been electrified.
So, okay, explain that. Why?
Well, you know, because you've been through the documents with me,
Right.
that there's a mental health element to this case.
Okay.
And that there may be a mental health defence that could be raised.
Sure.
Nobody else knew that.
Of course. Okay, so they're hearing that for the first time.
You're in my head.
Gotcha.
The listeners are in my head. You all know what I knew.
Sure.
For everybody else, that's the first time they've heard that.
So they've come back for this special hearing not knowing what it's about, and then, okay, so that's been dropped on them as part of this process, so they're now going, hang on, what was that?
And then it continues. She says, "I do understand that there is a question that remains as to whether there might be a drug-induced psychosis problem, but I might be wrong there."
Okay. So again, this would be the first time they would have heard this at all because they haven't had access to this knowledge beforehand.
You've heard about ayahuasca.
Yes.
You've heard about the community.
Correct.
The listeners out there have heard about Greylands, but you're all existing as I was on September 30th, 2015. You've
Okay.
got that inside knowledge and you've got that context. They're hearing this for the first time with no context, with no understanding.
Yep.
They already wanted the documentation because they were convinced I had it.
Yeah.
Now they really want the documentation.
Because they're starting to get a bit of an insight into what may actually be inside that documentation.
Exactly right.
Okay.
And Her Honour continues. "There may be an issue whether drugs played a role in the defendant becoming acutely unwell."
Okay.
She's not wanting to let this information out, but in my opinion, Her Honour's letting this information out.
Well, she's certainly making it very, very attractive to want to understand more about what is actually in that documentation.
In trying to put the toothpaste back in the tube,
Yeah.
the spillage is going to all the other media.
Yeah.
Then she said something that I have never heard a magistrate ever say.
Okay.
"May I suggest that if the parties consider it appropriate, they reach an agreement and perhaps hold a press conference or have an agreed statement that might be regarded as adequate to explain the status of the case thus far. I'm not expecting that to happen, but it might be a compromise position that could be attempted to satisfy public interest in the case."
So, hang on, just explain to me, what would that achieve by being able to have a public press conference in this situation?
You know, I'm really not sure, because you're asking the prosecution and defence in an adversarial system to come to an agreed perspective on a case that may yet go to a jury trial and present that to the public. I don't understand to this day the sense in that request.
Yeah, no, okay.
How does that affect anything? You're asking the prosecution and defence for their opinion on whether information that you've already released
Yeah.
should be released more widely.
Okay.
Your solution to that is for the prosecution and the defence to be the ones who release the information rather than you?
Okay, that seems very interesting. I'm not sure I follow. I'm sure there's a rationale in the line of thought that has been followed there. Unless you want the onus of the release being on someone else other than yourself, I'm struggling with that.
Well, that's where I got to with it. And I'm not saying that I know how Her Honour was thinking, nor am I trying to put words in Her Honour's mouth.
Correct.
But it did feel like a passing of the buck.
Yeah.
You know, I know the advertiser's not going to publish because they've told me they're not going to. I'm not entirely certain I trust them on that. But maybe somebody else can deal with this now, please. Thank you.
Yeah, okay.
It left the prosecution and the defence in a very unenviable position.
Yes.
And they were not happy about it at
Okay.
all. Daniel, you asked me earlier in this episode how the public would feel. Why can't I have this information right now? Why shouldn't it be released to me?
Absolutely.
Well, Greg Mead, representing Cy Walsh, had an answer for you and for everybody that had that question.
Okay.
And he made that submission to Magistrate Shepherd in answer to this whole press conference concept. He said no material should be made available Because public curiosity is not the same as public interest.
Okay, yep.
Because public interest is a higher test that is about what is in the best interests of the public.
Right.
And he said the best interests of the public are served by my client having a fair trial process.
I was just thinking that. I was just saying what is in the best interest. The best interest in the terms of being fair and just and someone getting the opportunity to be adjudicated as such would be not to have that tainted by the wider distribution of this material.
And tainted is the word. As he said, many of the documents that I had read might prove to be irrelevant or inadmissible
Correct.
if the case went to trial.
Sure.
Think about, let's pick one for example, Stephen Trobiani saying, Cy told me that Mum was going to set the G-men onto me.
Yeah.
They might decide, well, that's inadmissible, that's prejudicial, we're not going to let the jury hear that. Oh, but we read it in the Advertiser or saw it on the news before that.
And that's how you prejudice that jury, and therefore you don't have that fair and just trial process.
That's right. And Prosecutor Lucy Board agreed. She said, as Your Honour has identified, whether this is a drug-induced psychosis or if there is an underlying psychiatric condition is a very live issue. There is a very real risk of contamination of further evidence to come.
Okay.
So, like I said to you, just because I've read 7 boxes doesn't mean I've read everything.
No, that's right.
I'd read everything to that point in September.
Yes.
Could be something completely new that could come out of left field that could change the game.
Okay.
So, quite wisely, Her Honour said, okay, I deny the applications to copy and publish the material.
Mm-hmm.
So therefore, the decision we'd already made that we weren't going to publish as the Advertiser, now there's a court order stopping us.
Okay. So you guys essentially had made the right decision, made the right call, justified in that process of saying we're not going to do it.
Vindicated and validated.
Absolutely.
The mentality of the current court reporter and the former court reporter, now editor, were on the mark. Our instincts were correct.
Yeah.
However, she said media organisations who had sought permission to view the documentation would be granted access to it.
Okay.
But they could not talk about what was in it.
Right. So you can't have it, you can look at it, but you can't talk about it.
That's right.
Okay.
So you can sit there and if you want to make notes of the documents for future reference, absolutely you can do that.
Sure.
But you can't do a story saying, there are 16 ballistics reports and 15 witness statements and
Sure.
Kane Corns was a witness and Stephen Trobiani was a witness and Graham Watt was a witness. You
Okay.
can't talk about the nature.
Okay.
The only thing that the media were allowed to say about the documentation was that Meredith Walsh had given a witness statement about the incident itself.
Which, when you put that in comparison to 7 boxes of documents, it feels very light on, I'll say. However, when you're talking about the context and perhaps the gravity that could have in regard to the process to come, it actually probably seems right on the, if you put that in judgment.
Absolutely. Now, Daniel, I'm going to test your memory.
Okay.
Where were you on the night of September 30th, 2015? Because I know where you were, and I'm going to tell you in a minute, but I want you to remember.
If you know where I was, I'm either I'm slightly concerned that and off the top of my head, I can't think of where I was. I can only hope that potentially I was somewhere with you.
You were in a pub with our friend Luke Gramola,
Okay.
waiting for me.
Right, okay, fair enough.
We were having a boys' dinner that night, and I
Right.
was running late.
Okay.
The reason I was running late was because of this story.
Right. Well, I was gonna say if you say so, I'll believe you. Now you've read evidence as to that. All
And
right.
I'll tell you why I remember.
Sure.
Because when I finally got to the two of you,
Yeah.
and just as Luke was pulling back on his first drink,
Yeah.
my phone went off, and I had
Okay.
to excuse myself. And you may remember as I talk about this, I vanished into the front bar.
Okay, if you say so.
I got a call from Lucy Board, the aforementioned prosecutor,
Okay.
which started with, "Tell me you're not publishing that in the morning."
What?
I said, "I'm sorry, Lucy, what are you talking about?" She said, "Have you seen Channel 7? "No." "Can you see Channel 7 where you are?" I'm like, "Yeah, I'm at a pub. I'll go into the front bar."
Okay.
So I went in the front bar and I caught the tail end of Channel 7's coverage.
Right.
She said to me, "Did you see it?" And I said, "No, I didn't." Channel 7 had run a graphic on screen,
Yeah.
a bullet point list of what was in the Cy Walsh documentation.
So exactly what we just said you couldn't do.
Names of witnesses, style of documents,
Wow.
number of documents, this many witness statements, this many psychological reports, statements including luminaries like blah, 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 all laid down on the screen in bullet points. This had been specifically suppressed by court order.
Yeah.
We've talked a little bit about suppression orders in this show. We will talk about them more in the future. What you need to know is that if you breach a suppression order in South Australia, it's a $120,000 fine.
Right.
And you can face jail for it.
Yeah.
The prosecution was livid.
Mm.
Lucy Board said to me, "Tell me you're not publishing the same thing in the morning." I said, "Lucy, you know we're not publishing that.
Yeah, right.
Of course we're not going to do that."
Okay.
"Well, why would Channel 7 do this?" she said. And I'm like, "I honestly don't know. You're going to have to discuss it with them."
It sounds like a serious error of judgment there.
She said, "Are the others going to do the same thing?" I said, "I don't know. I really hope not."
Yeah.
So I left it with her. As it would turn out, Channels 9, 10, and the ABC, their coverage was spot on, perfect, exactly what you're allowed to say.
Okay.
Think about the restraint that takes. They don't know as much as I know, but they know there's more.
Mm-hmm.
They may have had a bit of time that afternoon to start sifting through those 7 photocopying paper boxes full and gotten just a glimpse of the treasures on display.
Yeah.
And somebody's pressed the button too soon, gotten too excited. What do I always say to you? If you're excited about a story, that's the moment you pump the brakes.
Absolutely. Either that or they just clearly haven't understood where the limitations of what that verdict came down from the courts was.
So Channel 7's gone over the line.
Yeah.
And some of the responses that came out of that on social media were very, very nasty. Things like, sounds like an episode of How to Get Away with Murder, or why can't the public be told? If this was any other case, they throw everything out in the open.
Yeah, and that's, that's probably, unfortunately, quite a common sentiment that was coming out from the public at that point, because it's that emotive response I talked about. That emotiveness of our coach, the situation, someone committed murder, we want justice to be upheld in it, whatever we feel that might be.
But also now you've told people there's a secret.
Yeah.
They can speculate on what that secret is.
Yeah.
And worse, you've told them that you can't tell them. Channel 7 has effectively in this situation gone, we know everything. They didn't. And here's everything we can't tell you.
Yeah, right.
Whereas the advertiser and the other media organisations had simply said, there are suppressions on the case, there is a bunch of evidence, includes Meredith Walsh's witness statement.
So, with Channel 7 stepping over the line, making that error of judgment, what happens from that? I mean, you said there's implications up to $120,000, etc., for breaching these suppression orders, but what happens in this case?
So things go backstage now. The court case is not due to come on again until November 3rd.
Okay.
But prosecution and Channel 7 start dueling via email. And I know this anecdotally, so I'm not going to go too deep into it. This is, friend of a friend told me.
Yep.
But there was back and forth about whether or not Channel 7 were going to be prosecuted.
Okay.
I was keeping an eye on the case lists every day because obviously if Channel 7 were going to get in trouble, I wanted to come along, see what was happening.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe there was a story in it, maybe there wasn't. Channel 7 took down the original version of their story from the internet, put up a changed version, which exists to this day, and that was going on in the background. Meantime, my media colleagues had access to these 7 boxes of documents. And here's the thing. At the Tiser, there's 3 court reporters.
Mm-hmm.
At the television stations, there's 1 per station.
Right.
You know that these boxes took me out of circulation for a day.
Yes.
And writing up the articles as a result took me out of circulation for several days.
Yes.
The TV stations can't afford to do that. They don't have the resources available to them to lose a reporter for an extended period of time, especially to sit in a registry. And here's the other thing. It took me all that time to get through that document, all of those pieces of paper. Imagine bucket brigading it. Channel 7 finishes with the document, passes it to Channel 9, who then go through, who pass it to Channel 10, who passes the ABC. It would be a nonsense.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
I told you how small that registry was. It would be completely overwhelmed.
Yeah.
So the media's turning up at different times of the day, basically viewing by appointment to see these documents. My poor colleagues, we'd go hear a court case in the magistrate's court at 10 o'clock. It would finish at 10:30. I'd leave. One of them would go to the registry to take their turn to start going through the Walsh documents.
Yeah, right.
So, understandably, the decision was made amongst Adelaide's electronic media. We really need copies of this. I know Her Honours said we can't have copies, but this is untenable for us. It's unworkable. The advertisers had it. Fairness dictates that we should have it. We should have copies. The DPP's refusing to budge.
Okay.
They're busy deciding whether or not they're going to prosecute Channel 7.
Right.
They don't want anybody else having copies of this information.
Makes sense.
As far as the DPP is concerned, you're lucky you've got what you've got.
Yeah.
And so the whole thing comes back to court on the 3rd of November.
Because the 3rd of November, we were coming back to court that was the next piece of the Cy Walsh situation anyway, wasn't it?
Before any of this erupted, that was the date we were going to find
That's
out
right.
about the toxicology results.
Okay, gotcha. All right.
Cast your mind back several episodes of this podcast.
Yeah.
We were waiting on the toxicology result from that strand of hair.
And this is what I was saying right at the top. You know, the I guess the processes and the situation and the drama that would unfold outside of the courtroom has almost overtaken what's going on. I mean, we're talking about in a very short vacuum of time. Yet this. Can we have the documents? Can we have who's breached the documents? What can we now do with the documents? Has almost become as much important, bigger than. Oh, hang on. There's actually a case we're supposed to be understanding, which is by its own nature the highest priority case we've had of someone for how long in this state.
And it was all consuming. Listeners, to give you a peer behind the curtain for a second here, when Daniel and I were talking about this episode, my recollection of everything we've just talked about was that it happened in the space of a couple of days.
Yeah.
Because it was so intense, so full on, so all consuming that I thought it was a very short period of time. But this was like a month's worth of backstage goings on.
Yeah.
As the media is fighting each other, the courts, everybody else, for this documentation that, again, I should not have had in the first place. And look, do any of you doubt now that I shouldn't have had it? Look what it's caused.
Yeah.
You compared it to Pandora's box?
Oh, absolutely. And in the wrong hands, this would have been incredibly damaging. We saw it almost was without it being completely in someone's hands. So imagine the kind of damage this would have done if it was. That said, we're going to head back to court on November 3rd, not even for that, but to try and get back on track with the case itself. So despite everything else that's going on around this, we're back in court on November 3rd, and we're actually back in court because we're about to get the results of the toxicology reports that we've been waiting for.
That's right. And Lucy Board tells the court that the toxicology results have arrived, but they need further expert analysis.
That's very anticlimactic.
What a letdown.
At least you didn't have to say, but you can't say anything. You can't tell anyone what's in them because we don't know.
Well, she didn't say you can't tell people about the toxicology report.
Right.
But she did want to re-agitate a few key points about the documentation.
Oh.
We're not before Magistrate Elizabeth Shepherd anymore. The case has been shifted to the jurisdiction of the state's Chief Magistrate,
Okay.
Judge Mary Louise Hreibel.
Right.
So Her Honour is now overseeing this going forward. Probably a good idea given everything that's fallen and how high profile this is.
Sure.
Ms. Board asks Judge Hreibel to revoke Magistrate Shepherd's order granting the media access to the witness statements and other documents filed with the court.
Okay.
Already, you can't copy it,
No.
you can't take it away, but now you shouldn't even
And
have
have
access
access.
to it anymore. She said the revocation was necessary due to a television news report about the case that had breached the terms of the order.
Okay.
She stressed that all other print and radio outlets and other TV stations had followed the precise terms of the order and said, the order has caused a great deal of distress to the wife of the deceased, who is also the mother of the accused. It's also affected a number of other witnesses who have given their statements to police safe in the knowledge, or so they thought, they were confidential.
Yeah.
This is still an ongoing investigation, and we are still attempting to gain statements from witnesses who, as a direct result of the television broadcast, have gone to ground. This is an ongoing investigation that is being hampered by the order handed down by the previous magistrate.
There's some interesting stuff in that. So, the fact that obviously this has caused stress to Phil's wife, Meredith, which is something you called out earlier. If you had gone ahead with what you had, the information you knew, what could that do? We've now seeing what it could have done. The other side to that is we are potentially, scaring witnesses off from coming forward. They're going to ground, as you said. So people are concerned that their anonymity might be jeopardized here. Is that what I'm understanding?
That's exactly right. Look, two of my worst nightmares about reporting are coming true right now.
Okay.
A direct influence on an investigation.
Mm-hmm.
Someone saying, I know something about Cy Walsh, but I'm not going to tell the authorities because I don't want my name in the media.
Sure.
And normally, that's okay. That's what happens. Yeah, your witness statement is completely sacrosanct. Oh, whoops, it's been released.
Yes.
And that means we have to be fair and equitable and consider releasing it to everybody else.
Yep.
And most of all, the trauma being caused to Meredith Walsh.
Yeah.
You know, I know, the listeners know everything that was in her statement. Nobody else but her at that point knew it.
Yeah.
And me.
Okay.
And she's existing on the good graces that I'm not going to breach a court order.
Yeah.
Now, we all know I'm not going to breach a court order.
Mm-hmm.
How can you have any faith that the advertiser's not going to breach the court order when Channel 7 has?
That's right.
You know, guilt by association. All media are the same. All journalists are scumbags. There's no way that they're going to hold fire.
Yeah.
Now, look, other organisations might have seen, just to backtrack a little bit, the Channel 7 story and said, publish right now. They've breached the order. We've got to go with what we've got. Otherwise, we're going to be behind.
Yeah.
That was never a consideration in the Tizer newsroom.
Okay.
Not for a second. It was, Channel 7, what have you done?
Yeah, right.
But Meredith didn't know that.
Indeed.
And the prosecution had no reason to trust either.
Yeah.
So Ms. Board is making the application here. Time to lock it all down.
And that's what I was going to say. So you can understand why Lucy Board here is going, actually, we now want that rescinded. We want that removed completely. Can we have that readjusted that no one has access?
And these are the words that echo in my head. This is an ongoing investigation that is being hampered by the order handed down by the previous magistrate.
Yes.
That's a very difficult thing for a prosecutor to say about a judge or a magistrate's unfettered discretion.
Yeah.
This is why it's unfettered discretion. These decisions are supposed to be beyond reproach and beyond question.
Yeah.
You don't get backsies on releasing information.
Sure.
Yet this entire situation has been a case of, we need backsies on this decision.
Yeah.
As you can imagine, all the other media leapt up to argue this point. They didn't have the documentation.
That's right.
Some of them had a little bit of notation that they'd made. Others were still trying to desperately convince the court to give them photocopies. I had everything.
That's right.
I sat there quietly. Not just because I had everything safe in the knowledge that my stories were, by that point, pretty much finished, but because I didn't believe we should have had them in the first place, and we've just lived through why.
Yeah, exactly.
You asked me at the top of this show, why shouldn't the public know at this point? This is why. How are you going to achieve a just outcome for Meredith,
Yep.
for Cy Walsh, for Phil's memory, for the family, for the community, for the courts, if it's all being played out in public too soon?
Yeah. So November 3rd, we went there for the toxicology. We said, okay, we need more time. That needs more investigation. We've tacked on the fact that, hey, can we have this removed?
Which Judge Hreibel agreed.
Yep. That was my next point. So
That's right.
We've agreed. Yep. We're
Locked it
removing
down.
access.
Locked it down.
Okay.
Her Honour said that needs to go.
Sure.
It's not appropriate at this stage for the media to have access.
Yep.
So those 7 boxes are going back in the vault, Raiders of the Lost Ark style.
Right. So from November 3rd then, now what?
It's all put off again until December 11th of 2015, when we're expecting Cy Walsh is going to answer the charge one way or another.
So all this time we've been collating information, going through this process. We've got to hear toxicology reports. No, not quite yet. December, he's actually going to face the charge and give his response to that.
That's right. And we're past football season now.
Yes.
It's over and done. I'm thinking to myself, finally, we're going to reach a point where something's going to happen. I'm probably still not going to be able to publish everything that I know, but a lot of those other publication concerns are out of the way.
Okay.
Whatever's going on with Channel 7 and the DPP has faded into the background. Everything's settled down. Let's get this case back on track. On December 11th of 2015, Cy Walsh pleads not guilty to the murder of his father by reason of mental incompetence.
Now, is that, in your opinion, something you were anticipating?
I think by that point, I had anticipated that it would at least be argued.
Okay.
You know, I couldn't make up my mind one way or another, so I'm sure that everybody else was still considering.
Yeah.
The defence had come to a settled position. Our client was not guilty by reason of mental incompetence.
Okay.
As we've talked about previously, that obviously leads to limiting terms, objective elements, all the things that we talk about, except Ms. Board stood up and said, Your Honour, we're not prepared to accept that plea because we have discovered that a particular drug was located in Cy Walsh's belongings at the time of his arrest.
So we're still waiting for toxicology results, but now we've found some substance on Cy. So this is just spiraling ongoing again.
And this is a shock to me because there was nothing in those documentations about him having drugs on him. Remember, he said he hadn't taken anything.
Yeah.
He'd sworn that black and blue to so many people. I knew about ayahuasca.
Yeah.
But now, according to this, he had something on him at the time of his arrest.
And with that, to understand what this substance was, how this would tie into the case, the toxicology results, and so much more as this case would continue on and on into the next year, we will pick this up the next year ourselves, as this is going to be the final episode of Just Lawful for 2021.
There are so many people out there taking your name in vain right now.
That's okay. I don't say that lightly. I understand this is going to be the last episode for 2021. With that stated, thank you so much to everyone who has been on this journey with us all this year for this case, this series, and every series that we've covered throughout this entire first season. Thank you so much for your support.
I've said it on social media. This has been one of the most fulfilling experiences, if not the best experience in my journalistic career. Daniel, thank you to you for making all of this happen. Thank you to everyone who supported us. Thank you to the SA Press Club for recognising us with an award as part of your 2021 awards season.
Absolutely. Thank you, Sean, to yourself for being so real, honest, candid, authentic, and giving of yourself and your experience, because without you in this, it is literally just me looking at cases and talking my opinion. Thank you for being who you are and giving yourself to this project, because that has been the unique piece of this that's made it the success it is, in my opinion. Thank you to all of the families that we've been in contact with who have been so just trusting in us to bring their story and their voice to the fore. Thank you so much for the interviews that we've been able to do this year, people coming to the studio and opening up their hearts, their experiences, and some of the most traumatic things that they've lived through. Thank you so much to them. Thank you, as you said, to the SA Press Club, which, let's face it, Sean, you and I put together an idea. We somehow made it onto the airwaves and made it a real thing. And 6 months into that, we were accepted by your world. I'm going to call it, it's not my world, it is still your world, the world of journalism, to be recognised for that, nominated, have that nomination accepted, and somehow, incredibly humbling that we actually won an award for what we've been able to put together.
Yeah, if you run into Daniel in public over the Christmas period, make sure to call him an award-winning journalist. He absolutely loves it, I tell you. He loves it so much. 2
parts of that which are very, very, just very daunting for me. A, the journalism part, and B, the fact that it's award-winning just blows me away. Until we get there, once again, we just want to thank everyone who has listened to us this year, this season, this episode, either the broadcast on 5AA or through the podcast on both iTunes and Spotify. We thank you greatly. Thank you for being a part of this. We love your feedback, as Sean said earlier. If you want to get involved in that and give us your feedback, you can certainly do that at Just Lawful Podcast on Facebook, Instagram, at Just Lawful Pod on Twitter. You can follow Sean at Sean Fuster for Facebook and Twitter for all of Adelaide's true crime and his work with the Advertiser. We would so greatly love to hear you back next season. Again, in the meantime, go back to iTunes, Spotify, rate, review, listen to the back catalogue of what we've done so far to get you ready as we continue this story next year. Until then, please take the time over this holiday period to spend time with your loved ones, hug them, hold them, appreciate them, be careful on the roads, do everything you need to do to come back next year. And until we get the chance to do that, we want you to enjoy our work, but don't become our work. And we'll speak to you next year on the next episode of Just Lawful.